some good stuff today. Chapter 20, Emancipation means freedom. And I think that's really important. It's really cool. So that's awesome. So let's learn about the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? And then we'll go to chapter 29 for a minute, and we'll learn about the three big amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Really, it's just to say, hey, can we make African Americans equal? Can't everyone be equal? Amendments. You know what I mean? That it's amazing these had to be written into law. They just should have been the law from the beginning. All right, but it's at least it's good that we fixed a lot of the problems. So let's go into that and let's read about it. And it does show how awesome McClellan is again too, by the way. So. All right. Lincoln needed a victory because he wanted to do something important. He wanted to make an announcement. He wanted to change the purpose of the war. And he didn't want to do it as the leader of a discouraged, defeated army. Then finally it came. It wasn't the kind of victory Lincoln had hoped for. Too many men had been killed, more than ever before. But the Northern Army had stopped General Lee's army at Antietam Creek, and that would have to do. The Battle of Antietam is sometimes called the Battle of Sharpsburg because Antietam Creek is near the little town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. McClellan had some unexpected luck just before the battle at Sharpsburg. One of his men found 3 cigars wrapped in some paper. The cigars probably dropped from the pocket of a Confederate officer. The papers showed Robert E. Lee's battle plans. "Here's a paper," boasted McClellan to an old West Point friend, "with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." McClellan now knew exactly where all of Lee's forces would be. Even with that help, he didn't whip Robert E. Lee on September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day of the war. But he did stop him. Both sides suffered terrible losses at Antietam Creek. But when it was over, things were worse for the Confederates. They were hungry and exhausted. They had few supplies, and they were in easy reach of the Yankee army. Another attack by the North, and they might have been finished. But 2 days after the battle, McClellan watched the rebels retreat. He let them cross the Potomac River back to Virginia. Lincoln took a train to Sharpsburg and urged McClellan to go after Lee. McClellan had 2 divisions of fresh soldiers. "I came back thinking he would move at once," said Lincoln. I ordered him to advance." McClellan sat for 19 days. Then he moved slowly. He let the Confederate army get away. Lincoln was enraged. He believed he had lost a chance to end the war. He wasn't the only one. Northern soldier Elijah Rhodes wrote a letter home saying, "Oh, why did we not attack them and drive them into the river? I do not understand these things, but then I'm only a boy." Soon after Antietam, Lincoln did send McClellan home. McClellan did not go willingly. He said, "They have made a great mistake. Alas for my poor country." Still, Antietam was a victory for the North, and an important one. Robert E. Lee had been on his way to the northern state of Pennsylvania. He had intended to cut important railroad lines in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He had hoped to find shoes and supplies for his army in the north. Now a discouraged Confederate army was back in Virginia. Lincoln could make the announcement he had planned for several months. Lincoln now changed the war from a fight to save the Union into something much greater. He changed it into a battle for human freedom, a battle to end slavery. He did that with a document called an Emancipation proclamation. It said all the slaves in the rebel states were free. I'm going to repeat that. All the slaves in the rebel states were free. It was about time, said the abolitionists. It was the right time, said Lincoln. He read the proclamation in September of 1862. It became official on January 1st, 1863. It didn't free slaves in the North. There were a few slaves there. It didn't free slaves in the border states. The president didn't have the power to do that. It could only be done by a constitutional amendment or by the state legislatures. It freed slaves in the Confederate states, where Lincoln had no power. Today, when you think about it, it doesn't sound as if Lincoln really did much. People in 1862 knew differently. They knew what he had done was very important. When he signed that document, it meant there was no going back. When the war was over, there would be no chance of compromise on slavery. Slavery was dead in the South, and if it was dead there, it would soon die in the border states. People's ideas had changed, and Lincoln's ideas too. He had never liked slavery. In fact, he hated it. But he thought it more important to save the Union than to end slavery. He had come to realize that was impossible. Slavery was like a worm in a good apple. It was making the whole apple rotten. It was no longer enough just to save the Union. Who wants to fight for a nation with a rotten core? The nation could not allow an evil practice and believe in itself. It could not speak of liberty and equality and be cruel and hateful to a large group of its own people. And so, the Civil War became a revolution. Not a revolution as the Southern leaders saw. They still thought they were fighting for the independence. What those leaders wanted was independence to oppress other people. No, this was a revolution in men's and women's ideas. They had been led by the logic of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Was this a nation that really believed that people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that all are created equal? Or were those just empty words that applied only to special people? If blacks could be enslaved, then what about northern factory workers, or war prisoners, or any group of people? The war was making people think. It was making them question ideas they had never really considered. Are some people actually better than others just because their skin is a different color? Perhaps green-eyed people are the best, or short people. Could curly hair be superior to straight hair? And what about baldies? Maybe they would make good slaves. One thing everyone knew. This war, begun with such gaiety, had become a national nightmare. It was not a game. The corpses of American boys were being shoveled into the earth. Hundreds of thousands of them. And so people asked themselves, what is this war really about? It was clear in the South. Southerners were fighting to preserve their way of life. It was a way of life that was often elegant and attractive. And it was based on a mean, despicable practice, slavery. If the South was fighting to preserve slavery, then the North must be fighting to end it. And so it was. But it took Abraham Lincoln and most Northerners some time to figure that out. Perhaps that was because there was much racial prejudice in the North, and that had to be overcome. Voices were speaking out against that racial hatred. Finally, people began listening to them. One of the voices belonged to a man who spoke clearly and said the North must lift the war into the dignity of a war for progress and civilization. That the man's name, of course, was Frederick Douglass. And he had been a slave and had whip marks on his back to prove it. Douglass had learned to read and write against great odds, was one of the most eloquent writers and speakers of his time. He knew it was folly to fight just to save the Union. Douglass wrote, "To fight against slaveholders without fighting against slavery is but a half-hearted business, and paralyzes the hands engaged in it. Fire must be met with water. War for the destruction of liberty must be met with war for the destruction of slavery." And thus the Civil War became a war to make the United States what it had meant to be from its beginnings: a fair nation, a great nation, a nation that fulfilled the best ideas of its founders, a nation that would set equality of opportunity as a goal, a nation that could promise life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and meant it for all its peoples. Usually the president signed government bills with a simple "A. Lincoln." But when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln wrote his name in full. "Gentlemen," he said to the cabinet officers standing near him, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than in signing this paper." All right, so now, Connor, while we turn to chapter 29, do you want to show them what you did tonight? You got what?
I got a brown belt.
Brown belt.
On karate.
All right, congratulations, buddy.
Yeah.
All right, is that near a black belt?
Yeah. So I have to wait a little bit till I'm 13 to get a brown belt, but I have.
You mean a black belt?
Yeah. So.
All right, good job, buddy. Congratulations. Yep. All right, now back chapter 29, page 139. I just need to read. We're going to read about the 13th Amendment, the 14th and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment freed slavery everywhere. It made slavery illegal in America. Admittedly, they had some border states that had slaves in the 4 states. Maybe they wanted to keep it. Fine, man. Even then, they barely could do it. They barely had the votes. Abe Lincoln didn't clown around. He had to twist every arm, kind of convince every person he could in the Senate and the Congress. They barely got that passed. I'm amazed. And it was just the North. The North. No, the South. The South's gone. They barely could pass that bill. But they did. So that's good. All right, let's read about it. Making amends. You see that in the brown?
Yes.
When the Constitution was written back in 1787, it had a terrible flaw. What was that terrible flaw? After the Civil War, 3 amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th were passed. They corrected the flaw and did something else too. The amendments added more of the spirit of the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, adopted in 1865, prohibited slavery, got rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868, gave equal protection of the law to all Americans. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, said that all citizens have the right to vote. Women citizens? This amendment didn't say yes and it didn't say no, which was too bad. It would take another amendment to make that clear. And there's a picture of black men voting after the war. The votes gave blacks real power. Then, until well into the 20th century in the South, they lost their vote and their power. That was mostly in the South where they lost that right. Not everything was great up north, too. I mean, there was racism everywhere. But down south in particular, it was obvious and oppressive. And we'll learn about that continue. But basically good news, okay? We got Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment getting rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment guarantees everyone's rights under the law. And that's a lot of problem right now with African Americans not being treated fairly. The 14th Amendment protects them, and that's how a lot of these bad police officers are getting in trouble. The 14th Amendment guarantees right to fair treatment under the law. And then, of course, the voting, the 15th Amendment protects voting for everybody. All right, so we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.